linking us up.
Absolutely, he was very helpful, and he is very helpful and supportive. He helps to so many initiatives now in Ukraine, so it was great to receive support from him.
He's a very good guy.
He is. Okay, so we will start.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us and watching this lecture online. My name is Tymofii Brik. Absolutely, he was very helpful, and he is very helpful. I am assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics. I broadcast from my apartment in Kyiv. This is the third week of this terrible invasion of Russia attacking Ukraine. This war has caused so many deaths among civilians, but we also remind to our audience that this war has been executed not only against civilians, our statehood. This war has also attacked our culture, knowledge. Our universities were bombed, and a lot of academics and students are now displaced or refugees. So Kyiv School of Economics has initiated this series of lectures, which we call Global Minds for Ukraine. We invite leading intellectuals, scholars, diplomats, artists to talk with us and to talk with our students and discuss what is happening today in Ukraine from different perspectives. We are talking about economy, politics, strategies, and how to cope or to win this war. And today we have a very special and distinguished guest, Professor Eliot Cohen from Johns Hopkins University. Well, his resume is very big. He has held a lot of academic positions, written many books. I think he can, he's a man who doesn't need an introduction. And today we want to talk with him about his recent publication on the Atlantic, which is called The Strategy to Defeat Putin. And we are very honored to have him for this opportunity to discuss his writing and his ideas in person. So, Professor Cohen, it's a pleasure to have you. I pass the word to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Tymofii. I'm not just being polite when I say that I truly feel honored to be with you. I think these are extraordinarily difficult times for your country, and there are many, excuse me, many people outside across the world who feel deeply for what you are going through. Let me make just two quick preliminary remarks and then speak a little bit more formally. The first is I'm obviously acutely aware that I'm here and you're over there in danger. And I know that words of support from people who are far away and who are themselves safe can feel hollow. And I hope that's not going to be the case here. The second thing, which I confess I've wrestled with whenever there's been a war and I find myself trying to talk about it, is the difference between the emotional reality of war and the analytical reality. And I'm minded of the words of a poet who actually spent most of his life in Ukraine. He was a Hebrew poet, Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was born in Ivnitsia in Zhytomyr Oblast in 1873. And he has a very famous poem called On the Slaughter. And the lines that came to me as I've thought about this war and seen the terrible sights that some of you have seen probably firsthand, and all of us have seen on the internet and the news, are these. V'im yesh tzedek yofia miyad, achim acharei hishamdi mitachat rakia hatzedek yofia, yumogar na kiso la'ad. If there is justice, let it show itself at once. But if justice show itself after I've been blotted out from beneath the skies, let its throne be hurled down forever. I think that's an emotion that many people feel when they see the things that we see in Ukraine. Still, as a professor and somebody who has served in senior positions in government, it's my job to analyze. So let me analyze necessarily from an American point of view. But I think that may, or I hope it may be hopeful to you. There's really four quick sets of remarks. The first is on surprises. The cognitive psychologist Daniel Kahneman, in his wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about many different kinds of biases that we have. And one of the most powerful is the hindsight bias. That is the tendency to say, I knew it all along. The tendency to see things in retrospect as having been inevitable and to convince ourselves that we understood that in the past, when in fact, of course, we're all surprised by life. And in no way is that more true than when we're talking about war and conflict. And I think it's very important for us to hold on to that moment of surprise, because in many ways it has the most to teach us. And I would just say that there are four major surprises which we should hold on to and think about. The first has to do with the personalities that we see and their influence on events. And most importantly, of course, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. I think with regard to Putin, it is striking to me how many people in the West, including experts, I was at the Munich Security Conference just before the war was launched by Russia, expected Putin either not to attack, or if he attacked, to do some kind of limited, clever, coercive attack, not this massive onslaught. And I think we've learned things about his personality, which are very disturbing and unfortunately to a lot of people surprising. And then there's the surprise of your president, who was, I think it is fair to say, systematically underestimated around the world, but particularly in the West, perhaps even domestically, and who has really had just an extraordinary impact here in the United States and elsewhere. Second big surprise, I would say, is Russian military incompetence. I think many people, particularly anybody who knew anything about Ukrainian history and culture, is not surprised that you've put up an extraordinary fight and a competent fight as well, because the Ukrainian military is not the same military that it was 8 years ago. But it's the incompetence of the Russian military which has shocked people. And I think that's a result of too many analysts spending too much time looking at bits and pieces of technology, looking at numbers, and looking at doctrine, rather than at all the things that Karl von Clausewitz, in his masterwork on war, taught us really matter in war: determination, perseverance, will, but also matters like discipline. And I think that's something that should stick with us for some time. The third thing is the American and the European reaction. I will confess that I was pleasantly surprised by the way in which my government was able to lead the diplomatic reaction to the Russian invasion, but also its willingness to grasp, particularly on the front of sanctions, for measures which we had never really considered before. And I will also say that the European reaction was surprising to me, and I think surprising to many others. Of course, particularly the pivot of Germany to all of a sudden becoming a serious national security player in Europe, being willing to ship arms to a live conflict zone. But there's much, much more than that. I think the unanimity thus far, at any rate, of the EU and of NATO is surprising and in many ways heartening. And then the fourth surprise is in some ways the most significant. What this war is doing is it is resurfacing first order issues of freedom and of people's willingness to fight for freedom. Now, those were issues that we didn't, in a way, we haven't dealt with for a very long time, in some ways not since the Second World War. But because of not only the invasion, but the truly heroic resistance that your country has put up, those are now on the table. And I think those will have very important, subtle, long-term consequences around the world. I'll give you one that may just seem minor from your point of view, but is actually, I think, significant here in the United States. We, of course, have been living through a period of tremendous partisan division fighting over all kinds of issues, some important, some not. And what is so striking to me has been the bipartisan consensus of Republicans and Democrats alike in Congress, in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, on the importance of supporting Ukraine, arming Ukraine, perhaps going further than that. And indeed, the only real argument out there is, should we be doing more than the Biden administration is already doing? And that was something of a surprise. Second big issue is, where are we now? And here I would say that where it looks from here, and bearing in mind that I'm not seeing firsthand civilian casualties, burning apartment buildings, wounded soldiers, all of that. But I think, just as a military analyst, I'm fundamentally a military historian more than anything else, Ukraine is actually winning. No matter what indicator you look at, the movement of front lines, Russian casualties, which, even if you accept the lower American figure as opposed to the higher Ukrainian figure, when you factor in wounded, missing prisoners, the Russians have really been suffering disabling losses. The percentage of their equipment which has been abandoned, not destroyed, the inability of Russia to operate truly effectively in the air, the losses of at least 4 general officers, and I could go on, tell me that it is not only is the Russian military not a particularly competent military, it's actually losing. And the point that I would make there is the war remains what it has always been, which is a test of will, both the will of armies, but also the will of peoples. And, you know, in regard to that key element, Ukraine is a lot stronger than Russia. I would also say that in the longer run, Ukraine is winning, again, at a terrible cost, because of the nature of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. There are various estimates about what will happen to the Russian economy over the next year or so, but it's pretty clear to me that it's going to be pretty devastating. And it will leave Russia a much weaker power than it has been before. Third set of issues, how will this conclude? I think the least likely outcome is with a Ukrainian defeat, in the sense of not just being occupied, but really being subjugated. I think even if the Russians are able to occupy major Ukrainian cities, at first I think they would do it at a terrible loss, but I think your struggle would go on. I do not think this is a war the Russians can win. What is somewhat more likely is, which some people have talked about in the West, is some sort of stalemate. But I find that actually a little bit hard to believe, although less hard to believe than talk of Ukrainian defeat, because war is dynamic. I mean, the Russians are having incredible difficulty, as far as I can tell, supplying themselves, sustaining morale. It's going to get more difficult when they try to send in replacements, as I assume eventually they will. I don't think it's going to stabilize. And so that leaves really 2 outcomes. The first will be a deal that attempts in some ways to give Vladimir Putin an exit. And the other is a substantial, but probably an incomplete Russian defeat. Both of those are more probable, although what they look like, I don't know, because it's, I think, patently obvious that no Ukrainian leader can trust anything that the Russians say, anything. And so, you know, what kind of deal you can have under those circumstances, I don't know. And I don't believe that Ukraine can really accept the kinds of territorial claims that Russia will make. And it certainly should not accept anything remotely looking like limitations on its armed forces. A Russian defeat is, I think, actually a plausible outcome, in the sense that you could see the collapse of Russian units, with people either running away or surrendering, and the Ukrainian military recovering ground. What is a little bit harder to see is how the Ukrainian military can really do what the Poles did in their war with Russia in 1920, that is to really drive them off of completely off your territory. What about the longer term implications? Well, the first is the isolation and containment of Russia. One of the points I've made in these articles that I've been writing in The Atlantic is the United States and its allies are not going to invade Russia. And even if Vladimir Putin falls, which a number of people here believe is likely, and I think is quite plausible, sometime over the next year or two, it is very unlikely that we'll have a Russia that can really be welcomed back into the family of nations. It'll be a Russia that feels itself to be wounded, a Russia which may be looking for revenge further down the line. And so one of the big challenges is going to be to construct security structures behind which Ukraine can rebuild and which will keep NATO safe. Secondly, I think what we're seeing is a deeper alignment between China and Russia. This is something the United States did not want to see, but an alignment that's going to be limited. I mean, it's based in part on the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. It's based most deeply on a shared hostility to the United States and a desire to divide the American attention. But there are a number of friction points in that relationship, and we can, with effort, make those worse. So just one or two examples. Chinese businesses will probably not want to do business in Russia if they think they'll be subject to secondary sanctions. Indeed, I mean, globally, I don't think any company that gets a choice between doing business with Russia that is heavily sanctioned, where it's very hard even to get goods there, and doing business with Europe and the United States will want that. So I think that's a big new strategic fact that we have to deal with. A third long-term implication is the recovery of NATO, and indeed a new sense of purpose in the European Union. I doubt very much that the European Union, despite the wishes of President Macron of France, will be able to turn into anything like a military alliance for a whole bunch of very good reasons. People want the United States there, and that means NATO. But what we've seen is really an extraordinary recovery of NATO. And I believe that will continue. And we've also seen a removal of what has been the real friction point between the United States and its European allies, and that's over defense spending. That's a very long-standing thing. It predates Donald Trump, and in many ways that's removed. So I think we'll end up with a NATO that's stronger than ever. And then finally, just from an American point of view, I think we're going to have to go through a fundamental strategic reconsideration. In the United States, the strategic consensus had been the need to shift our focus to the Indo-Pacific. And in many ways that will continue. But it's also clear that the security issues in Russia, and to some extent by extension, even into the Middle East, are going to claim our attention too. That's not what we wanted. The United States has done it before, so it's not beyond us. But it's going to require a lot of rethinking. It's also, I believe, going to require more resources. And I don't think we've faced up to that yet. So there's a great deal that's up in the air. One thing that I think is absolutely certain, again, I speak as somebody who was, although one of my grandparents was from Ukraine, but I wouldn't claim to be hugely familiar with Ukraine. But one thing I think is quite certain is that there'll be a different kind of Ukrainian independence and nationhood that you are forging right now than you have ever had before. You will be a different country. There's a tremendous difference between independence that is given to a country or that is won peacefully and independence that is won through a war and with terrible, terrible sacrifices. President Zelensky said that you were fighting, said on a number of occasions now, that you were fighting for universal democratic values, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, political openness, and that's true. But I think that you're doing something else, which is even more profound, and that's showing the depth of that commitment. You know, I'm from New England, the northeastern corner of the United States, which was really the cradle of the American Revolution. I grew up in Massachusetts. The state immediately to our north is New Hampshire. And the state motto of New Hampshire was given by General John Stark, who was truly a Cincinnatus-like figure, a farmer who kept on going back to lead his countrymen in war and then returned to the farm, very much like the Roman hero Cincinnatus, and like so many of your soldiers. He was asked to give a toast at a gathering of veterans 40 years after a major battle where he led the American forces. And he said his toast was as follows: "Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils." Now, live free or die became the state motto of New Hampshire. Interestingly, it only became the state motto in 1945. In other words, immediately after World War II, when Americans, I think, had a very acute sense of the sacrifices that one has to make to stay free. In recent decades, and certainly I know even when I was growing up, you see that slogan on a flag or on a license plate. It doesn't mean that much, or it means something, but not a lot. It's another very different thing to live it as you are. And in doing so, I think you remind all of us about what it takes to win freedom and to keep it. And that is really quite a tremendous gift that your country has given to mine and to many others. So let me stop there, Tymofii, and we can take this wherever you like.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these words and your strategic analysis. I have to also address the elephant in the room. I'm talking from my shower, and I need to explain that this is a shelter that we where we go in case of the airstrike alarms. And I advise to all of our students who are watching us right now to proceed to a safe place, because we've heard such alarms just a few minutes ago. And, you know, before this lecture, we had this pleasure of chatting online, and we discussed broadly what you can discuss and your expertise. And nevertheless, I want to ask something which we, we did not mention before. Your introduction was very touching, and the poem which you cited also touched me personally, because my own grandfather is also from the Zhytomyr region. He was Jewish, and he eventually migrated to Israel just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is also very personal to me and to my family. And I just wanted to ask you, how do you feel about this narrative of denazification of Ukraine, which is pushed by the regime of Putin, and how is it perceived in the West by intellectuals, but also by regular common people? Can you tell us whether it's perceived as something legitimate? Does anyone buy it except domestic Russian audience, and how can even they buy it?
No, the short answer is nobody buys it. Really nobody buys it. I think, my grandparents emigrated to the United States at the end of the 19th century. So we did not, as I said, I had a grandfather from Uman, others from the Pale of Settlement. But so we didn't have a whole lot of family over there during the war. Although I have my uncle married a woman who survived Bergen-Belsen. And I think for anybody who World War II touched, it's just disgusting. It's truly disgusting. But I think the good news is it's also ludicrous. You have a Jewish president. Everybody knows that. So and even, in the United States, you have a few, as you have everywhere else, a few of what Lenin called useful idiots. And so you have useful idiots who are going to make some excuse for Putin about, it's all our fault because of NATO expansion or something like that, which is also stupid. But nobody buys it. And I think what it does is it makes the Russians look at once both evil, but also ridiculous. And, that's an interesting phenomenon that, there's a lot of hatred right now for Russia. I mean, and some of it's quite unfortunate. I mean, some of it's stupid. People who don't want to read Dostoevsky. I mean, that's nuts. Or listen to Tchaikovsky. That's crazy. But there's also a kind of contempt out there, which is now part of the psychological picture. And there are a lot of people who I think, because of this conflict, have really, I think, in essence, given up on the idea of Russia being a normal state. And unfortunately, I think that's appropriate. I mean, I was always skeptical, I would say. And now that's kind of where I am too. And that's going to affect how you think about, our future dealings with Russia, even after Putin. I mean, even if, through some miracle, Alexei Navalny, gets released from prison and he's still alive and functional and he becomes the president of Russia, I think everybody will be wary about what Russia is for many, many years.
And then I'd like to maybe provoke you a bit, because I read your piece on the Atlantic, and you had this powerful message saying that Putin is the one who is responsible for this war politically and morally, and yet, we cannot escape talking about Russian population. And you just concluded your previous thought that, people see now what Russia is. So it seems like we cannot escape this debate about how to evaluate what common Russians, masses of Russians are doing and thinking now. Do you have any, advices from your deep historical background in dealing with different contexts around the world and wars? How do you usually proceed in, designing policies, diplomacy, cultural exchange in future after such a war? Do you need to profile people, interview people, judge people? Like, what should we do?
So, like a lot of Americans, I'm both a realist and an idealist, in the same body. The realist in me says that if you just look at, such polling as you can trust, and if you look at the control that the Putin regime has established over information in Russia, then the majority of the Russian population support him and support what he's doing and swallow the lies and believe in them. And in the short run, there's a limited amount that you can do about that. Now, the realist in me also says there has always been in Russia a difference between the intelligentsia and everybody else. So if you look at the populations of Moscow and Petersburg, they're in a different place than the bulk of the country. And I think more broadly, there's, now in Russia finally have some kind of middle class that has some sense of what normal Western life is, the kind of life that we all want, that feels deprived of it and will want it back. I'm actually amazed at how many people have taken the chances that they have to express opposition to the war, sometimes very bravely, like that news producer the other night. But I think there are a lot of other examples of that as well. And I think that will be there underneath the surface for quite some time. The idealist in me says, in the long run, truth is more powerful than lies. And in the long run, people will affirm those things, even if in the short run it doesn't look possible. And that's I think that's the story of the Cold War. It's the story of people like Václav Havel or John Paul II. You know, that's, and you just have to believe in that. As a practical matter, I think, you know, one of the things where there should just be a massive effort going on, and I hope it is, but I'm not sure I'm confident, is figuring out ways to break through the information barriers that you have, figuring out what's the most effective way to doing it. So I don't know if you've seen, there was a recent clip by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I suspect is probably pretty effective. I mean, I would defer to the Russianists. But whatever it is, we need to be working double time on that, on figuring out ways. And we've done this before, you know, that was Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and, you know, the American labor unions smuggling modems into Poland to help solidarity and so on. I mean, we've done this before. We need to do it in a different age. One thing that I think is very heartening is the way in which, I mean, it looks to me as though Ukraine has been able to recruit a cyber militia from around the world. And this is one of the things I think to put to them. Last thing I'd just say on this one is, although it does look right now as if the majority of Russians are buying Putin's narrative, over time, as you begin to have real economic suffering, as you have layoffs in factories, because I mean, like, I believe the Lada plant closed down because they can't get Western chips and stuff, as airplanes stop flying. But more importantly, as coffins come home, or urns of ashes, or at least where people are simply notified that loved ones have been killed, as you begin to see wounded soldiers, and you'll begin to see them, and not the pretty wounds, but the really ugly and disfiguring wounds, I think that'll begin to have an impact as well. The last thing I'll just say on this, the historian in me says this: every time Russia has had a war that hasn't gone well, it has shaken the state to its core. It was true of the Crimean War. It was certainly true of the Russo-Japanese War. Absolutely true of World War I, even World War II to some extent. Certainly the Afghan War. And I don't think this is going to be any exception.
Yeah, thank you. I see we have some questions in the chat because I follow other platforms as well. But before reading them, I want to ask my final question. Following to what you said, you premised your answer saying that you have this duality of realism, but also some sort of a romanticism in a way. And I also would like to clarify something. I'm asking this question mostly out of my ignorance. I'm trained in sociology, so I know the sociological scholarship, I know political science scholarship, and it is only quite recently I have started reading international relationship, of course, because of the current context. So I was wondering about your take on this school of realism in international relationships, because it seems to me that this is a very powerful and widely accepted school. And yet I see that it has missed so many important details that are happening right now. So in a way, in a very simplified manner, I see this school as some sort of a set of beliefs about, big nations and countries that have their zones of influence and legitimacy to play this big, powerful chess game. And it seems to me that this school has omitted agency of smaller, quote unquote, nations like Ukraine, and a simple miscalculation, forgetting about agency and sovereignty of smaller countries has led to this surprise with what is happening now with Russia and this surprising resist of Ukraine, even though it is not so much surprising to those who have followed the event in Ukraine. Yeah. So do you think that this big theory will be somehow reconsidered, re-evaluated, or is this something that is just a big part of the scholarship that will remain there intact? So can you clarify all that for me, please?
So What you need to know is I'm a renegade political scientist, and I was taught by some of the greatest political scientists of their generation, Samuel Huntington, James Q. Wilson. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have gotten my PhD in history. I mean, there are parts of political science, particularly political philosophy, that I still cherish. But I think particularly what you're describing, so-called realism, you know, it reminds me of a saying of George Orwell that there are some ideas that are so silly that only intellectuals can believe them. And that's actually where I think a lot of so-called realism is. It's actually not realistic. It's not just that it denies the agency of small countries. It denies the importance of personalities, of individuals. I mean, this war came about because of Vladimir Putin. The war is where it is, I think, in large part because of Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, if, God forbid, he had been killed in the first day, I don't think this war would have looked the same way, far from it, and the Western reaction. So they completely overlook personalities. They completely overlook contingency, you know, things that happen. And I have to say, as somebody who's served high up in government, if there's one thing you learn, it's stuff happens, it's a big surprise, and it happens all the time. And who the individuals are makes all the difference in the world. And finally, it's there's an element to it which I find morally odious. And it's, you know, it's odious in part because it's so simple-minded. So, for example, a lot of the realists like to go back to Thucydides and the Melian dialogue, in which there's this debate between the Athenians and the leaders of the city of Milos, which is revolted against them, and the Athenians are basically like, give in or else. And, you know, there's this chilling line where the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. Actually, what they're doing is the realists miss out on the whole story of the dialogue, because most of them are not very careful readers, including they're not careful readers of history. First thing is, the Athenians are making the case that, look, being part of the Athenian Empire is not a bad deal. We're actually not a repressive empire, which is true. But the other thing is, the way Thucydides tells the story, it's clear that the Melian dialogue is also a story of the moral decay of Athens, and Athens ceasing to be great because it's lost its moral core. So it's not surprising to me that some of these so-called realists have been, again, you know, what Lenin called useful idiots. I will say the most useful writers to me throughout this are Serhiy Plokhy, great historian of Ukraine, Timothy Snyder, also. I think we'd all, if we want the deep understanding, you want to read people like those. And then if you want to know what's going on, you really have to talk to people who have some idea what's going on and look at lots of sources. Last thing I'll say about this is, I think one of the great weaknesses of that kind of political science theorizing is what makes it so attractive. The idea that with a couple of ideas, a couple of very simple notions, you have these magic keys which will unlock all of human behavior. That's ridiculous. Human beings are complicated, and society is complicated. So my advice to any students out there considering concentrating in IR theory, I'd say major in history instead.
Great, thanks. It's always nice to finish a thought with a very concrete advice. As you said, you have advice to many governments, so you obviously know how to finish on a good bullet point. Yeah. And there is one question from the audience, Natalia Mostova. She asks a question: what do you think is Putin? Well, she is asking about Putin, Vladimir Putin. What do you think is his long-term objective of this war from geopolitical or other angle?
So, you know, there are different ways you can think about objectives. You can think about objectives as very concrete, well-defined things. You know, in the 18th century sense, Frederick the Great won in Galicia. But there's also objectives which are much harder to define, but maybe very real in the minds of people who are leading a war. I think Putin's primary objective at the moment is to survive. I assume that he understands that if this war really is seen as a huge failure, that he will probably not be in charge for very long, or he's certainly worried about that. I mean, he's sufficiently paranoid about his own security that you can tell that he worries about that a lot. So there's that. I think there are two big things for him, which account for his hatred of Ukraine and his waging of this war. The first is, I think he really does have a concept of Russia as an imperial state, which it's been throughout most of its history. And he understands correctly, I believe, that Russia cannot really be an imperial state without Ukraine. And if Ukraine is genuinely independent, then Russia is a pretty reduced state, as it has been in a way since the end of the Soviet Union. So he wants to reverse that, and I think he has, that's a very broad kind of objective that he has. I think the second, the other big objective is avoiding democratic contamination. The Russians clearly do believe that we actually instigated the color revolutions, that they're quite sincere in that incorrect belief. But I think one of the things that they understand is that the kind of society that they're trying to mold and the polity that they're trying to shape, it can only work if you don't have thriving democracies right on your border that are sufficiently like you to make your own people say, well, why can't we have that? So unfortunately, what that means is, so there are those three objectives, right? Survival, a reconstituted Russian empire, preventing democratic contamination. It's very hard for him. There's no really kind of compromise points there. I mean, there may be a compromise point on the first, where he gets something that he can declare to be victory. But those other two objectives are very nearly unlimited in a way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. By the way, I also wanted to mention that you suggested these great scholars, Tymofii and Snyder, and they both are also invited to participate in our lectures on solidarity. So they have confirmed, but we're just waiting for the date to announce.
Well, I would like to sign on for that.
And I wanted to circle back to your article on the Atlantic. In that article, you stated quite clearly that you stressed on the three pillars of the successful strategy. So you mentioned military support. You also mentioned sort of a new possible alliance for security. And you also emphasized that the sanctions should be strong. And it seems that all of your ideas have been taken seriously. Yeah, so we have seen increased military support. Of course, there was this debate about closing the sky. Instead, there were some other military weapons supplied to Ukraine. The sanctions are growing every day. And quite recently, Zelensky, when he was talking to the United States Senate, he himself suggested to create the new international organization that can either substitute or improve NATO. So what is your general take on that? Are you satisfied with how we're moving along these pillars? Do you think we should have some improvements? Do you see any light there, or maybe you have some criticism?
So on military support, I won't be satisfied until I begin hearing Ukrainians saying, "You're sending us too much stuff." I think it's whatever we're doing, I want us to do more. And I think, symbolically very important for us to begin doing things like really ramping up production of things like javelins and stingers and switchblades. Among other things, as a signal to the Russians and to everybody else that we are completely all in on this and utterly committed. So like I said, I think there's a lot of military aid that's flowing in, and that's great. There's probably a need for more, and they are working on it. I mean, I know, for example, they're working on trying to get the S-300s in, but also SA-10s, SA-8s, very competent air defense systems. I should explain to the audience that one of the things I did earlier on in my career is I ran the Air Force's study of the first Gulf War. So I've tried to follow air power things. Let me just talk about two issues there. One is the MiG-29 issue, and then the other question of no-fly zones and so on. On the MiG-29s, my feeling is that we should have done it, but not because I thought it would be particularly helpful. I think it would have been a very useful signal to Ukraine that we would do really whatever we took. The idea that there was any escalatory risk was absurd. But the truth is, increasingly, Ukrainian airspace is difficult for anybody to fly in because both the Russians and the Ukrainians have reasonably competent air defense systems. And I think, the most immediate thing we can do is make sure that the Ukrainian air defenses are so good that the Russians are just afraid to overfly Ukrainian territory. On a no-fly zone, I think, unfortunately, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here among some people who haven't paid much attention to what no-fly zones do. We operated no-fly zones over southern and northern Iraq for many years. What those periodically required was destroying surface-to-air missile batteries. They would turn on a radar and we would blow them up, and they would periodically fire missiles at us. I think that's what a no-fly zone entails. And at the moment, I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that. That may change, but I don't think so. And like I said, I think the most important thing is getting really good surface-to-air missiles into systems into your hand. I think there will be a different issue that will come up of NATO, some kind of military intervention if the Russians were to use chemicals or tactical nuclear weapons. And then I think we'd have a very different debate. And there may even be at some point a humanitarian argument. There are quite a few people who are actually talking more about the possibility of direct military intervention. I think that debate is still in its early stages, but it could happen. So on military support, I would just say lots more of whatever it is, because you guys, one of the things that's so remarkable about the Ukrainian military is you're using all of this very effectively. You're really, your success rates with things like Javelin and Stinger are very high. The air defenses have worked and it's astounding that the Russians have not been able to control the skies. On sanctions, there's still more that can be done. And I think there's an argument on both sides. Do you just slam down every last sanction, or do you hold some things in reserve? And I think the administration has decided to hold some things in reserve. But I think the key thing really is the purpose that you have in mind. And I believe that the purpose is this isn't a bargaining chip. Instead, what you're going to do is very deliberately do lots and lots of damage to the Russian economy and inflict suffering. And that's, there's a harsh reality in all of this, both in the military side and the sanction side. Wars are contests of societal will. And the question is, whose will is stronger? And we're going to operate against the will of the Russian people. And you're doing it by killing lots of Russian soldiers. And we're helping you do that. And we're also going to be operating on the will of the Russian people by damaging the economy. On the third pillar, which is really the alliance pillar, I'm actually not in favor of creating new international structures. I think that just gives you more headquarters. I am in favor of strengthening as much as possible, particularly the frontline states, of consolidating the NATO consensus on defense spending and on the Russian threat. I think if there is some kind of interim deal, I think it'll probably involve Ukraine's entry into NATO being deferred maybe for a long time, but there'll be some kind of security relationship with NATO countries, and we should be thinking about what that means. I do think what's going to come out of this is some of the European states are going to be playing a different roles than before. And the two I would single out are Poland and Germany. I was in Poland actually when the war actually broke out. And I spent some time with the senior Polish leadership. And I was just tremendously struck by their commitment and determination. And I think it's very important that the United States and other European states support the Poles in this. But the really interesting question is going to be Germany. If Germany spends all the money on defense that they say they're going to spend, it's going to be like the world's third largest military on the basis of spending alone. That'll be an interestingly different world. And I think it's in our interest to try to help make sure that that's done in a positive way, and that the Germans, we need Germany to begin acting like a more normal state. They've been, for reasons both good and bad, the trauma of the Second World War has inhibited them from exercising leadership. Some of that, I completely sympathize with and understand. To some extent, though, it's also been an excuse. And I think now people understand that, the best way for Germany to compensate for its past is not to opt out of European security. It's to be a major contributor to it. That's the best way of undoing that legacy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your answer. And actually, we're almost running out of time, so I'd like to say thank you for your for your ideas for this conversation. And I want to finish with reminding our audience about our initiative, our donation webpage. As you just said, support, we also need humanitarian support. And our school, Key School of Economics, has launched our own donation fundraising. We operate here on the ground. We know how to help people. We know how to organize logistics, and we know how to do it efficiently. And right now, quite a lot of people, both in the army, but also among civilians, are dying from losing their blood and not being able to protect themselves and cure themselves. So that's why we are purchasing in big bulk and shipping medical kits, helmets, bulletproof vests, and and that is our priority right now. And the donation page, which we have established, it's actually registered. The fund itself is registered in the US, in Washington, DC, which means that you can donate in dollars, in euro, in crypto. Everything is transparent, and the American organizations, they can even get the tax deductions according to law. So it's very easy to donate. I put the web page to our comment section. But you can just Google Kyiv School of Economics and you will see this page immediately. So thank you very much. And Professor Cohen, it is a pleasure and an honor to host you, to talk to you, and I want to extend my invitation and to invite you to Peaceful Kyiv. I hope very soon, and to talk to you in person.
I would like nothing better. I copied the link. We'll be we've made donations already. We'll make others. But I'm truly honored to have been asked to be with you. I look forward to being with you in person. And I don't know if I'll pronounce it correctly, but Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you very much and take care.
Bye-bye.